The sound of muffled laughter echoed through the concrete walls of the shooting range as Sarah Martinez walked through the entrance, her small frame dwarfed by the towering men in tactical gear who dominated the space. What they didn't know was that the quiet 28-year-old elementary school teacher carrying a modest gun case had spent the last 3 years secretly training with her grandfather, a decorated Marine sniper who had taught her that true marksmanship wasn't about muscle or swagger. It was about discipline, focus, and the courage to prove doubters wrong. In a world where assumptions run deeper than bullet casings, some stories don't just hit their target. They shatter everything people thought they knew about who belongs behind the trigger. This is the story of how one woman's quiet determination turned a room full of skeptics into believers, one impossible shot at a time. What happened next would not only silence the laughter, but would challenge everything these seasoned shooters believe about skill, gender, and the deadly art of precision shooting. Because sometimes the most powerful weapon isn't the one you carry. It's the one nobody sees coming. Sarah Martinez pushed through the heavy glass doors of Precision Point shooting range on a humid Tuesday evening in August, the familiar scent of gunpowder and cleaning solvent greeting her like an old friend. The fluorescent lights cast harsh shadows across the concrete floor, and the steady pop-pop-pop of gunfire created a rhythm that most people found intimidating. To Sarah, it sounded like home. She had been coming to shooting ranges since she was 8 years old, when her grandfather, Staff Sergeant Miguel Martinez, first wrapped her small hand around a .22 caliber rifle and taught her the fundamentals that would shape her life. But tonight was different. Tonight, she was walking into hostile territory. The main lobby buzzed with the usual evening crowd, mostly men in their 30s and 40s, dressed in tactical pants and military-style shirts. Their conversations peppered with technical jargon about grain weights and muzzle velocities. Sarah stood out like a wildflower in a field of concrete. At 5 feet 2 inches tall and weighing barely 110 pounds, she wore simple jeans, sneakers, and a plain blue t-shirt. Her dark hair was pulled back in a practical ponytail, and she carried a modest black gun case that looked almost comically large compared to her petite frame. The conversations didn't stop when she entered, but the tone shifted. She caught fragments of whispered comments as she approached the counter. "Looks like someone's lost," muttered a bearded man in camouflage cargo pants, earning chuckles from his companions. "Probably here for her boyfriend," added another, not bothering to lower his voice. "Hope she knows which end the bullets come out of," came a third comment, followed by more laughter. Sarah had heard it all before. In her 3 years of visiting various shooting ranges across the state, she had encountered every type of skepticism, condescension, and outright hostility that the firearms community could muster toward women, especially women who didn't fit the expected mold. She had learned to let the comments roll off her back like water off a duck's feathers. Behind the counter stood Marcus Thompson, a grizzled former police officer whose weathered face told stories of 30 years on the force. He looked up from his paperwork with the tired expression of someone who had seen every type of person walk through those doors, though his eyebrows raised slightly when he saw Sarah approaching alone. "Evening," he said gruffly, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed. "First time here?" "Yes, sir," Sarah replied politely, setting her gun case gently on the counter. "I like lane time, please." "1 hour." Marcus studied her for a moment, his experienced eyes taking in her calm demeanor and the confident way she handled her equipment. In his years of running the range, he had developed a sixth sense about people. There were the nervous first-timers who needed constant supervision, the show-offs who were more dangerous than skilled, and the quiet professionals who knew exactly what they were doing. Sarah fell into a category he couldn't immediately identify. "You've been shooting long?" he asked, pulling out the standard waiver forms. "Since I was 8, she answered simply, beginning to fill out the paperwork with practiced efficiency. This caught Marcus's attention. Most people embellish their experience, especially when they felt they had something to prove. Sarah's matter-of-fact response suggested either genuine experience or impressive confidence. "What are you planning to shoot today?" he inquired, nodding toward her case. "Custom 1911 chambered in .45 ACP," she replied without looking up from the forms. Hand loads, 230-grain bullets. The technical precision of her answer raised a few eyebrows among the men who had been listening to the exchange. Hand-loading ammunition was an advanced skill that required extensive knowledge of ballistics and powder charges. It wasn't something casual shooters typically bothered with. Hand loads, huh? Marcus repeated, his interest clearly piqued. You load them yourself? My grandfather taught me when I was 12, Sarah said, sliding the completed forms back across the counter. He was very particular about consistency. As she spoke, more of the range's patrons began to take notice of the conversation. The mention of hand loading had definitely gotten their attention, but many remained skeptical. After all, anyone could memorize technical terms from the internet. Lane 7 is available, Marcus said, handing her safety glasses and ear protection. Range rules are posted. You know about the ceasefire protocols? Yes, sir. When the buzzer sounds, weapons down, actions open, step back from the firing line. Marcus nodded approvingly. At least she knew basic safety procedures. He watched as she picked up her gun case with both hands, the weight of it requiring her to lean slightly backward to maintain balance. Several of the men exchanged knowing glances, their expressions suggesting they expected to be entertained by whatever was about to unfold. The shooting range itself was a long, narrow room divided into 12 individual lanes by concrete barriers. Each lane extended 50 yards to a motorized target system that could position paper targets at various distances. The constant echo of gunfire was amplified by the concrete walls, creating an environment that could be overwhelming for newcomers. Sarah made her way to Lane 7, conscious of the eyes following her every movement. She set her case down on the shooting bench and began her preparation ritual with the methodical precision that her grandfather had drilled into her thousands of times. First, she spread a small towel across the bench surface. Then, she opened her gun case, revealing a gleaming stainless steel 1911 pistol that looked almost too large for her hands. The weapon was clearly custom-made, with match-grade components and precision adjustments that spoke of serious investment and expertise. The whispers around her grew louder. Daddy must have deep pockets, someone commented, referring to the expensive custom pistol. Bet she's never even fired that thing, added another voice. This should be interesting, came a third observation, dripping with sarcasm. Sarah continued her preparation, seemingly oblivious to the commentary. She loaded her magazines with practiced efficiency, each cartridge sliding into place with a satisfying click of precision engineering. Her movements were deliberate and confident, suggesting muscle memory developed through countless hours of practice. At the lane next to her, a group of 3 men had positioned themselves with clear views of her activities. The apparent leader was Jake Reynolds, a former Army sergeant who had served 2 tours in Afghanistan and now worked as a tactical firearms instructor. His companions were equally experienced shooters who considered themselves experts in the field. Watch this, Jake murmured to his friends, loud enough for Sarah to overhear. $10, says she can't hit the broadside of barn. You're on, replied his friend Tommy, a police officer who moonlighted as a competitive shooter. Though I feel bad taking your money. The third member of their group, a lean man named Dave who owned a local gun shop, shook his head with amusement. This is going to be painful to watch. Sarah finished loading her magazines and inserted one into her pistol, chambering a round with a smooth, practiced motion. She placed her backup magazines on the bench within easy reach and positioned herself at the firing line. For the first time since entering the range, she turned and looked directly at the men who had been providing commentary on her every move. Her expression was calm and composed, showing neither anger nor intimidation. When she spoke, her voice was clear and steady. Gentlemen, she said politely, would you mind if I asked what distance you typically shoot for accuracy practice? The question caught them off guard. Jake recovered first, puffing out his chest slightly as he answered. We usually work at 25 yards for precision shooting, he said with obvious pride. Most people start at 7 yards, but we're past that amateur hour stuff. Impressive, Sarah replied with genuine respect in her voice. 25 yards requires real skill. Her acknowledgement of their expertise seemed to soften their attitudes slightly, though the underlying skepticism remained. "What about you?" Tommy asked, his tone slightly less condescending than before. "What distance are you planning to shoot?" Sarah smiled politely and walked over to the target control panel for her lane. The mechanical whir of the target system filled the air as she sent her target downrange, past the 7-yard mark, past 15 yards, past the 25-yard distance the men had proudly claimed as their standard. The target continued moving until it reached the 50-yard mark, the maximum distance the range allowed. At that distance, the standard bullseye target appeared impossibly small, roughly the size of a quarter when viewed from the firing line. A hush fell over the nearby lanes as other shooters noticed what she had done. 50-yard precision shooting with a handgun was the domain of master-level marksmen. It was the kind of distance typically reserved for rifle competitions, not casual evening practice sessions. 50 yards, Sarah announced matter-of-factly, as if she had said something as mundane as the weather forecast. "My grandfather always said that if you can hit your target at 50 yards, everything closer becomes automatic." The laughter that had followed her entrance had completely stopped. Jake, Tommy, and Dave exchanged uncertain glances suddenly, less confident in their earlier assessments. Other shooters in adjacent lanes had begun to pay attention, drawn by curiosity about the small woman who had just declared her intention to attempt shots that many of them wouldn't dare try. Marcus Thompson, who had been watching the scene unfold from his position behind the counter, shook his head with what might have been the beginning of a smile. In his 30 years of law enforcement and 10 years of running the shooting range, he had learned that the shooters who talked the least often had the most to say with their bullets. Sarah returned to her firing position, adjusting her stance with subtle movements that spoke of extensive training. She raised her pistol, extending her arms in a modified Weaver stance that balanced stability with natural point of aim. Her breathing became deep and controlled as she aligned her sights on the distant target. The range fell unusually quiet as word spread that something noteworthy was about to happen. Even shooters in other lanes had stopped firing, drawn by the spectacle of a petite woman attempting precision shooting at a distance that challenged experienced marksmen. In that moment of suspended anticipation, Sarah thought of her grandfather's words, spoken countless times during their training sessions in the desert outside Phoenix. "Mija, they will always underestimate you. Use that. Let them think they know what you're capable of, and then show them what's really possible." She took a final breath, let half of it out, and began to apply pressure to the trigger with the steady, controlled squeeze that had been drilled into her muscle memory through thousands of practice sessions. The shot, when it came, would be the first note in a symphony that would change everything these men thought they knew about shooting, about women, and about the dangerous assumption that appearance equals ability. The crack of Sarah's first shot echoed through the range with the sharp authority of precision ammunition, cutting through the ambient noise like a blade through silk. For a moment, the usual symphony of overlapping gunfire ceased as nearby shooters instinctively paused to assess what they had heard. There was something different about that shot, a quality that experienced ears could detect but couldn't immediately identify. Sarah lowered her pistol and activated the target retrieval system, the mechanical hum filling the sudden quiet as the paper target began its journey back from the 50-yard line. Jake, Tommy, and Dave craned their necks to get a clear view, their earlier confidence replaced by curiosity mixed with skepticism. "Lucky shot," Jake muttered, though his voice lacked its earlier conviction. "Probably hit the paper somewhere." As the target drew closer, details became visible that made the watching shooters lean forward unconsciously. There, in the center ring of the bullseye, was a single, perfectly round hole. Not just anywhere in the center ring, but dead center, a shot that would have scored a perfect 10 in any precision shooting competition. The silence that followed was profound. Tommy removed his ear protection to get a better look, squinting at the target as if his eyes were deceiving him. Dave's mouth opened slightly, then closed without producing words. Marcus Thompson, who had walked over to observe the proceedings, let out a low whistle of appreciation. "Well, I'll be damned," he said quietly, his voice carrying the respect of someone who understood exactly how difficult that shot was. The word spread quickly through the range with the efficiency of a military communications network. Shooters from other lanes began to migrate toward Lane 7, drawn by whispered reports of an impossible shot. Within minutes, a small crowd had gathered, their conversations hushed as if they were witnessing something sacred. Sarah seemed completely unaware of the attention she had attracted. She calmly inserted a fresh magazine and returned to her firing position with the same methodical precision she had displayed before. Her breathing remained controlled, her stance unchanged, her focus absolute. One shot could be luck, she said conversationally, her voice carrying just enough volume for the gathered observers to hear. My grandfather used to say that consistency is what separates shooters from marksmen. She raised her pistol again, and the crowd fell silent. The second shot came with the same sharp crack as the first, followed by the familiar mechanical whir of the target system. This time, the anticipation was electric as the target made its return journey. When the paper came into clear view, a collective gasp rose from the assembled shooters. The second bullet hole sat directly beside the first, so close that the edges nearly touched. At 50 yards, with iron sights and hand loads, Sarah had just demonstrated a level of precision that most of the observers had only read about in shooting magazines. Jesus Christ, Tommy whispered, his professional composure cracking for the first time. As a police officer who qualified quarterly with his service weapon, he understood the technical difficulty of what he was witnessing. That's not possible. But, possible or not, the evidence was hanging before their eyes. Jake found himself studying Sarah with new interest, noticing details he had missed during his initial dismissive assessment. Her stance was textbook perfect, balanced, and natural without the forced rigidity that marked inexperienced shooters. Her grip was firm but not tense, allowing for precise trigger control while maintaining consistent sight alignment. "Ma'am," Jake said, his voice considerably more respectful than it had been earlier. "Mind if I ask where you learned to shoot like that?" Sarah lowered her pistol and turned to face the group that had gathered around her lane. For the first time since entering the range, she smiled genuinely, the expression transforming her serious face into something warm and approachable. "My grandfather," she replied simply. "Staff Sergeant Miguel Martinez, Marine Corps sniper. 2 tours in Vietnam, 1 in Grenada. He believed that if something was worth doing, it was worth doing right." The mention of Marine Corps sniper training added crucial context to what they were witnessing. Military snipers were among the most elite marksmen in the world, trained to make shots under impossible conditions that would challenge the skills of Olympic competitors. If Sarah had been trained by one of these legendary figures, her abilities suddenly made perfect sense. "He's the one who taught you to load ammunition too?" Dave asked, his skepticism replaced by professional curiosity. As a gun shop owner, he had seen thousands of shooters over the years, but very few with this level of technical knowledge. "Among other things," Sarah confirmed, "he was very particular about consistency in everything. Powder charges measured to the 10th of a grain, overall length uniform to within 0.005 of an inch, primer seating depth carefully controlled. He used to say that precision shooting was 90% preparation and 10% execution." The technical details she rattled off impressed the gathered crowd as much as her shooting had. Hand-loading ammunition to those specifications required advanced knowledge of ballistics, expensive equipment, and countless hours of practice. It was the domain of serious competitors and professional marksmen, not casual hobbyists. "Would you mind if we watch you shoot a few more rounds?" Marcus asked, his request carrying the tone of someone asking a favor rather than making a demand. "I've been running this range for 10 years, and I've never seen shooting like that." Sarah glanced at the crowd that had formed around her lane, taking note of faces that had gone from dismissive to respectful in the span of 2 shots. She could have stopped there, having made her point with devastating effectiveness. But her grandfather had taught her another lesson that seemed relevant to this situation. When you have the opportunity to educate, you take it. "Of course," she replied graciously. Though I should warn you, things are about to get more interesting. She retrieved a different magazine from her gun case, this one loaded with ammunition that looked subtly different from her previous rounds. The bullets were boat-tailed match projectiles with a distinctive profile that serious competitors would recognize immediately. Sierra Match King bullets, 185 grain, she explained to the watching crowd. Different ballistic coefficient, different point of impact. I load these specifically for precision work at extended distances. Jake's eyebrows rose at this revelation. The fact that she loaded different ammunition for different applications suggested a level of sophistication that put her in the same category as professional competitors. Most recreational shooters used one type of ammunition for everything. Serious marksmen tailored their loads to specific applications. What's the difference in point of impact? Tommy asked, his question revealing his own advanced understanding of ballistics. About 2 inches low at 50 yards, Sarah replied matter-of-factly. But the ballistic coefficient is higher, so there's less wind drift and better velocity retention at distance. She raised her pistol for the third time, and the assembled crowd watched with the focused attention of students observing a master class. This shot came with the same crisp crack as the previous two, but when the target returned, it told a different story. The third bullet hole sat precisely 2 inches below her first two shots, exactly where she had predicted it would be. The grouping was tight enough to be covered by a quarter, demonstrating not just accuracy, but the kind of predictable precision that separated true marksmen from lucky amateurs. Unbelievable, Dave muttered, shaking his head in amazement. She called her shot to within millimeters. Word of Sarah's shooting had spread throughout the range, and more shooters continued to arrive at Lane 7. The crowd now included some of the range's most accomplished marksmen, men who had won regional competitions and held impressive credentials of their own. Yet none of them had ever witnessed handgun shooting of this caliber. Among the newcomers was Robert Shunn, a former Navy SEAL who now worked as a firearms instructor for law enforcement agencies. Robert had seen combat in 3 different theaters and had trained with some of the most elite shooters in the world. He approached the growing crowd with the measured curiosity of someone who had heard remarkable claims before and wanted to see the evidence for himself. I heard someone shooting sub-MOA groups at 50 yards with a handgun, Robert said to Marcus, his tone suggesting polite skepticism. Thought I'd come see what all the excitement was about. Marcus gestured toward the target hanging in Lane 7. See for yourself. Robert studied the target for a long moment, his experienced eyes taking in the tight grouping and calculating the angular measurements automatically. For a handgun at 50 yards, what he was seeing represented accuracy that rivaled precision rifles. It was the kind of shooting that belonged in record books, not casual practice sessions. "Who's the shooter?" he asked quietly. "The young lady right there," Marcus replied, nodding towards Sarah, who was in the process of loading another magazine. "Says she learned from her grandfather, Marine Corps sniper." Robert observed Sarah for several minutes, watching her preparation routine and noting the professional competence in every movement. Her gun handling was flawless, her safety protocols perfect, her focus absolute. These were the characteristics of someone who had been trained by a true expert and had put in the thousands of hours necessary to achieve mastery. "Ma'am," Robert said, stepping forward with the respectful manner that military training had ingrained in him. "I'm Robert Shunn, former Navy SEAL. I have to say, what you're doing here is remarkable. Would you mind sharing some details about your training background?" Sarah paused in her preparation to give Robert her full attention. She recognized the bearing and confidence of someone with serious military experience, and she responded with the respect that his service deserved. "My grandfather started teaching me when I was 8 years old," she explained. "Every weekend for 10 years, we'd drive out to the desert and practice. He taught me that shooting was a mental discipline first, physical skill second. The fundamentals had to be perfect before we ever worried about advanced techniques." "What kind of distances were you practicing at?" Robert inquired, his questions coming from professional curiosity rather than skepticism. "We started at 25 yards and worked our way out," Sarah replied. By the time I was 16, I was consistently hitting targets at 200 yards with iron sights. The number caused several sharp intakes of breath from the listening crowd. 200 yards was serious rifle territory, the kind of distance that challenged experienced shooters even with scoped weapons. Achieving that level of accuracy with handgun and iron sights represented skill that bordered on the supernatural. "Your grandfather sounds like he was quite a teacher," Robert observed with genuine respect. Sarah's expression softened at the mention of her grandfather. "He passed away 2 years ago, but I still hear his voice every time I shoot. He used to say that every shot was a conversation between the shooter and the target, and that you had to listen carefully to understand what the conversation was telling you." The philosophical approach to marksmanship that Sarah described resonated with the serious shooters in the crowd. They understood that precision shooting at the highest levels was as much mental as physical, requiring the kind of focus and discipline that few people possessed. "Would you be willing to demonstrate some of those advanced techniques?" Robert asked. "I think everyone here would benefit from seeing how a true marksman approaches their craft." Sarah considered the request carefully. She had come to the range for routine practice, not to provide instruction or entertainment. But the sincere interest and respect she was seeing from the crowd suggested that this could be an opportunity to honor her grandfather's memory by passing on some of the knowledge he had shared with her. "I'd be happy to," she said finally, "but I think we should make this more educational than simply showing off. Would anyone like to try some shots at 50 yards themselves? I can offer some tips that might help improve your accuracy." The suggestion transformed the gathering from passive observers into eager participants. These were serious shooters who were always looking for ways to improve their skills, and the opportunity to learn from someone demonstrating master-level ability was too valuable to pass up. Jake was the first to volunteer, his earlier skepticism completely replaced by genuine desire to learn. "I'd appreciate any advice you could offer," he said, moving toward the firing line with his own weapon. As Jake prepared for his attempt, Sarah positioned herself slightly behind him, ready to offer guidance. The crowd watched expectantly as the former Army sergeant prepared to test his skills against the same challenging target that Sarah had been hitting with such remarkable consistency. What happened next would provide a crucial lesson about the difference between theoretical knowledge and practical application, between military training and true precision marksmanship, and between confidence and competence. It would also demonstrate why Sarah's grandfather had been so insistent that his lessons be learned thoroughly before moving on to more advanced challenges. Jake positioned himself at the firing line with the confidence of someone who had qualified expert with military weapons and considered himself among the range's better shooters. His Glock 19 was a reliable service pistol that he had customized with night sights and a matched trigger, modifications that should have given him every advantage for precision shooting. He sent his target to the 50-yard line with the same mechanical whir that had accompanied Sarah's attempts, though the paper target seemed to shrink even further as it reached its distant position. From his perspective, the bullseye appeared impossibly small, roughly the size of a dime held at arm's length. "Take your time," Sarah advised gently, positioning herself where she could observe his stance and technique. "The target isn't going anywhere, and rushing never improved anyone's accuracy." Jake nodded and raised his pistol, settling into a modified Weaver stance that looked solid and professional. His grip appeared firm, his sight alignment careful, his breathing controlled. To most observers, he looked like he was doing everything correctly. But Sarah's trained eye immediately identified several subtle issues that would prevent him from achieving the precision necessary for 50-yard accuracy. His stance was slightly too rigid, creating tension that would interfere with his natural point of aim. His grip pressure was uneven, with his support hand applying more force than his shooting hand, which would cause the pistol to cant slightly during recoil. Most critically, his sight picture showed signs of hurrying, with insufficient time spent confirming perfect alignment before breaking the shot. The shot, when it came, was clean and authoritative, but the target told a different story than Jake had hoped. When the paper returned from 50 yards, it showed a hit approximately 6 inches low and 3 inches to the right of the bullseye. For most shooting applications, it would have been perfectly acceptable, but compared to Sarah's demonstration, it highlighted the enormous gulf between competent shooting and true precision marksmanship. "Decent shot," Sarah said diplomatically, studying the bullet hole with the analytical eye her grandfather had taught her to use. "But I could see a few things that might help tighten up your groups." Jake's ego smarted slightly from a miss, but his military training had taught him to value constructive feedback over false praise. "I'm listening," he said, genuinely interested in improvement. "Your stance is good, but you're fighting your natural point of aim," Sarah explained, demonstrating the concept by raising her empty hands in a shooting position. "When you extend your arms toward the target, they should point naturally where you want the bullet to go. If you have to muscle the gun into alignment, you're creating tension that will affect your accuracy." She guided Jake through a series of adjustments, showing him how to position his feet and torso so that his extended arms pointed naturally toward the target. The modifications were subtle but significant, transforming his rigid military stance into something more fluid and sustainable. "Now let's look at your grip," she continued, observing as Jake raised his pistol again. "Your support hand is working too hard. Think of it as providing a stable platform rather than actively squeezing. The shooting hand controls the trigger. The support hand just keeps everything steady." The watching crowd observed this impromptu lesson with fascination. Many of them had received formal firearms training at various points, but they were witnessing instruction at a level of detail and sophistication that most had never experienced. Sarah's ability to diagnose problems and provide solutions demonstrated not just shooting skill, but teaching ability that had clearly been learned from master instructor. "One more thing," Sarah added, stepping closer to observe Jake's sight picture. "You're rushing your sight alignment. At 50 yards, a tiny error in sight picture becomes a huge miss on target. Take the time to verify that your front sight is perfectly centered in your rear sight notch, with equal light on both sides, and the top of the front sight level with the top of the rear sight." Jake incorporated Sarah's suggestions and prepared for his second attempt. This time, his movements were more deliberate, his stance more natural, his grip more balanced. The improvements were subtle, but visible to anyone who knew what to look for. His second shot struck the target 4 inches high and 2 inches left of the bullseye, a significant improvement over his first attempt. While still not in the same league as Sarah's precision, it demonstrated that proper technique could make an immediate difference in accuracy. "Much better," Sarah confirmed, genuine approval in her voice. "You move your group about 4 inches closer to center with just those basic adjustments. Imagine what you could do with consistent practice." The compliment meant more to Jake than he cared to admit. Coming from someone who had just demonstrated shooting skills that bordered on the supernatural, any positive feedback carried serious weight. Tommy stepped forward next, eager to test his own abilities against the challenging target. As a police officer, he had always prided himself on his marksmanship, regularly scoring high on his department's qualification courses. But those tests were conducted at much shorter distances, typically 7 to 25 yards, making 50-yard precision shooting an entirely different challenge. "Any specific advice for someone who's used to shooting at closer distances?" he asked as he prepared his Smith & Wesson M&P 9mm. "The fundamentals are exactly the same," Sarah replied. "The only difference is that any error in technique gets magnified by the distance. Everything has to be more precise, more controlled, more deliberate." She watched as Tommy positioned himself at the firing line, noting that his stance was more relaxed than Jake's had been. Police training tended to emphasize practical shooting positions rather than formal competition stances, which could be either an advantage or a disadvantage depending on the specific technique. "Your stance looks comfortable," she observed. "That's good. Comfort leads to consistency, and consistency is what we're after." Tommy's first shot struck the target about 8 inches low, a result that would have been perfectly acceptable for most practical purposes, but highlighted the challenge of extreme distance shooting. The miss was actually better than average for someone attempting 50-yard handgun shooting for the first time, but Tommy's expression showed his disappointment. "The good news is that your shot was vertically aligned with the center of the target," Sarah pointed out, studying the bullet hole. That means your windage is perfect. The elevation error is probably just a matter of sight picture and follow through. She demonstrated the proper sight picture using her own pistol, showing Tommy how the relationship between front and rear sights had to be absolutely perfect to achieve the precision necessary for long-distance accuracy. At 7 yards, you could be a little sloppy with your sight alignment and still hit center mass, she explained. At 50 yards, even a tiny error will take you completely off target. Tommy's second attempt incorporated Sarah's guidance, and his improvement was immediately apparent. The bullet struck the target only 3 inches low and perfectly centered horizontally, a dramatic improvement that drew appreciative murmurs from the watching crowd. "Outstanding," Sarah said with obvious pleasure. "You just cut your group size by more than half." That's the kind of improvement that comes from understanding the fundamentals rather than just going through the motions. Dave approached for his turn with a custom 1911 similar to Sarah's, but chambered in 9mm instead of .45 ACP. As a gun shop owner, he had extensive technical knowledge about firearms, but had always focused more on the mechanical aspects than pure marksmanship. "I've been selling guns for 15 years, he admitted as he prepared for his attempt. "But I've never really pushed myself to see what I could do at extended distances." "That's more common than you might think," Sarah replied, understanding. "Most shooters never test their limits because they assume they know what those limits are. Sometimes we surprise ourselves." Dave's shooting style was different from his predecessors, more methodical and deliberate. His first shot struck the target about 5 inches low and 2 inches right, a respectable attempt that showed he understood the basic requirements of precision shooting. "You're taking your time, which is good," Sarah observed. "But I think you're overthinking your trigger pull. Trust your fundamentals and let the shot surprise you." The concept of a surprise break was one of the most difficult aspects of precision shooting for many people to master. It required trusting in proper trigger technique while allowing the subconscious mind to complete the shot without conscious interference. Dave's second attempt showed marked improvement, striking the target only 2 inches low and nearly centered horizontally. The progress was encouraging and demonstrated that with proper guidance, significant improvement was possible even for experienced shooters. As the impromptu lesson continued, more shooters gathered to observe and participate. The range had effectively transformed into a classroom, with Sarah serving as an instructor whose credibility had been established through demonstrated performance rather than claimed credentials. Robert Shunn, the former Navy SEAL, stepped forward with a customized Sig Sauer P226 that showed signs of serious use and careful maintenance. His approach to the firing line was markedly different from the others, displaying the measured confidence of someone who had used firearms in life-or-death situations. "I'm curious to see how my combat shooting translates to precision marksmanship," he said as he prepared for his attempt. "Different applications, different techniques." "Very different," Sarah agreed. "Combat shooting is about speed and reliability under stress. Precision shooting is about perfection under controlled conditions. Both require excellent fundamentals, but the application is completely different." Robert's first shot demonstrated the difference between combat training and precision marksmanship. His bullet struck the target about 4 inches low and 1 inch left, a shot that would have been perfectly adequate for most tactical applications, but revealed the gap between practical accuracy and competition-level precision. "Interesting," he mused, studying his result. "I can see that I've been prioritizing speed over perfection for so long that my precision technique has suffered." Sarah nodded understandingly. Combat veterans often face that challenge when transitioning to precision shooting. Your muscle memory is optimized for a different type of shooting entirely. She worked with Robert to adjust his technique, helping him slow down his shot process and focus on perfect sight alignment rather than acceptable sight picture. The modifications required him to override years of combat training, but his military discipline allowed him to incorporate the changes quickly. His second shot struck the target only 1 inch low and perfectly centered horizontally, a remarkable improvement that drew genuine applause from the watching crowd. The precision represented a skill level that most recreational shooters never achieved, accomplished by someone who was essentially learning a new application of familiar skills. As the evening progressed, the informal lesson at Lane 7 had become the range's primary attraction. Shooters from every lane had either participated directly or observed the instruction, creating an atmosphere of shared learning that was unusual for a typical practice session. Marcus Thompson watched the proceedings with growing amazement. In his years of operating the range, he had seen many good shooters and a few great ones, but he had never witnessed anything like what Sarah was demonstrating. Her ability to shoot with surgical precision was remarkable enough, but her skill as an instructor was equally impressive. "Folks," Marcus announced to the gathered crowd, "we're going to extend evening hours tonight. This kind of instruction doesn't come along very often." The announcement was met with enthusiastic approval from the shooters, many of whom were experiencing significant improvement in their accuracy for the first time in years. The combination of expert instruction and immediate practical application was proving to be remarkably effective. As the crowd prepared for the next round of attempts, Sarah reflected on her grandfather's words about teaching. "Mija, knowledge that isn't shared dies with the person who possesses it." When you have the opportunity to pass on what you've learned, you honor not just your teacher, but everyone who might benefit from that knowledge. She had come to the range for routine practice, but the evening was evolving into something far more meaningful. The skepticism and condescension that had greeted her arrival had been replaced by genuine respect and eager learning, demonstrating once again that performance speaks louder than appearance. But as the lesson continued, Sarah sensed that some of the spectators were beginning to wonder about the full extent of her abilities. The shots they had witnessed were impressive, but they had all been fired under ideal conditions with unlimited time and no pressure. The real test of a marksman came when the stakes were raised and the margin for error eliminated. That test was about to present itself in a form that would challenge not just her shooting skills, but her ability to perform under pressure that her grandfather's training had prepared her for, but she had never actually experienced. The impromptu lesson at Lane 7 had drawn the attention of nearly everyone in the range, but it also attracted someone who had been watching from the back with growing interest and skepticism. Eric Morrison stood 6 feet 4 inches tall, with the build of someone who had spent years in competitive shooting, and his presence commanded respect among serious marksmen throughout the region. Eric was the reigning state champion in practical pistol shooting, holder of multiple regional records, and owner of a custom gun shop that catered exclusively to competitive shooters. His reputation in the firearms community was legendary, built on years of dominating competitions and a string of victories that had made him something of a local celebrity. He had arrived at the range for his own practice session and initially paid little attention to the commotion at Lane 7. But as reports of Sarah's shooting filtered back to him, his curiosity had evolved into skepticism and, finally, into professional interest. Claims of sub-MOA handgun accuracy at 50 yards were the kind of thing that serious competitors investigated personally. For the past 30 minutes, Eric had been observing Sarah's instruction and the remarkable improvement she was generating in other shooters. Her technical knowledge was clearly extensive, her teaching ability impressive, and her demeanor professionally competent. But he had also noticed that all of her shooting had been conducted under ideal conditions with unlimited time and no pressure. In Eric's experience, shooting under perfect conditions was only half the equation. True marksmanship revealed itself when the stakes were raised, when time pressure was applied, and when the comfort zone was eliminated. Anyone could make good shots when they had all day to line up their sights and control their breathing. As the evening's instruction began to wind down, Eric made his way forward through the crowd, his imposing presence causing conversations to pause as people recognized him. His reputation preceded him, and most of the shooters present knew exactly who he was and what his presence might mean. "Quite an impressive demonstration," Eric said as he approached Sarah, his tone polite, but carrying an undercurrent that suggested more than casual interest. "Your grandfather obviously taught you well." Sarah turned to face the newcomer, immediately recognizing the confident bearing and expensive equipment that marked him as a serious competitor. His custom 1911 was a work of art, with modifications that probably cost more than most people's cars, and his shooting jacket displayed patches from competitions across the country. "Thank you," she replied graciously, though she sensed that his comment was leading towards something more substantial than simple compliments. "I'm Eric Morrison," he said, extending his hand with the firm grip of someone accustomed to commanding respect. "I own Morrison Custom Guns and compete in practical pistol events throughout the region." Several members of the crowd murmured recognition of the name. Eric's reputation as both a gunsmith and competitor made him something of a legend in regional shooting circles, and his presence added an entirely new dimension to the evening's events. "It's nice to meet you," Sarah said, accepting his handshake with the proper firmness that her grandfather had taught her was essential in establishing credibility with serious shooters. "I've heard of your shop. Your reputation for precision work is well known." The compliment seemed to please Eric, though his expression remained serious and evaluative. He was clearly building toward something significant, and the gathered crowd sensed that the evening was about to take an interesting turn. "I have to say, what I've seen tonight is remarkable," Eric continued, gesturing toward the target that still hung at 50 yards. "Precision shooting of that caliber is rare, especially from someone I haven't seen in competitive circles." There was an implicit question in his statement, and Sarah recognized it as the kind of professional curiosity that serious competitors often displayed when encountering unfamiliar talent. "I've never been interested in formal competition," she replied honestly. "My grandfather taught me that shooting was a personal discipline, not a public display." Eric nodded understandingly, though his expression suggested he was processing this information carefully. "Competition has a way of revealing capabilities that practice never tests," he observed. "It's one thing to shoot well when you have unlimited time and perfect conditions. It's something else entirely when there's pressure and consequences." The comment hung in the air like a challenge, though Eric's tone remained conversational and respectful. Sarah understood exactly what he was suggesting, and she felt her grandfather's voice echoing in her memory. "Mija, there will always be someone who wants to test what you've learned. When that moment comes, you honor your training by accepting the challenge with grace and meeting it with competence." "What did you have in mind?" she asked calmly, her voice carrying the same steady confidence that had characterized her shooting throughout the evening. Eric's smile was the expression of someone who appreciated directness and respected courage. "I'd like to propose a small challenge, if you're interested. Nothing formal, just a friendly test of skills between two shooters." The crowd immediately perked up with interest. The possibility of witnessing a head-to-head competition between Sarah and Eric was the kind of opportunity that shooting enthusiasts rarely encountered. Eric's reputation made him the clear favorite, but Sarah's demonstrated abilities suggested that the outcome might not be as predictable as it appeared. "What kind of challenge?" Sarah inquired, her tone suggesting genuine interest rather than intimidation. Eric walked over to Lane 8, adjacent to where Sarah had been shooting, and began setting up his equipment with the practiced efficiency of someone who had prepared for countless competitions. His movements were precise and economical, suggesting thousands of hours of practice and refinement. "I was thinking we could each fire 5 shots at 50 yards. Best group wins," he proposed as he arranged his gear. "To make it interesting, we'll put a time limit on it. 2 minutes total, from start signal to final shot." The suggested parameters transformed the challenge from precision shooting into practical marksmanship under pressure. 2 minutes for 5 shots at 50 yards was aggressive timing that would eliminate the luxury of extended sight picture and perfect breathing control. It was the kind of challenge that separated recreational shooters from competitive marksmen. Marcus Thompson, who had been observing the developing situation with keen interest, stepped forward to serve as an unofficial match director. "Gentlemen," he said, then corrected himself with a smile. "Lady and gentlemen, if you're serious about this, we should establish some ground rules." The crowd gathered closer as Marcus outlined the parameters of the impromptu competition. Each shooter would fire 5 rounds at a clean target placed at 50 yards. Timing would begin with an audible start signal and end when the final shot was fired. Scoring would be based on group size, with the smallest 5-shot group declared the winner. Stakes? Eric inquired, his question carrying the casual tone of someone for whom competition was a natural part of existence. Sarah considered the question carefully. She had never been particularly interested in monetary competitions, but she understood that serious challenges required meaningful consequences to maintain their integrity. "How about this?" she said thoughtfully. "If I lose, I'll publicly acknowledge your superiority as a marksman and recommend your shop to anyone looking for precision gunsmithing." Eric raised an eyebrow at the proposal. "And if you win?" Sarah smiled with an expression that would have been instantly recognizable to anyone who had known her grandfather. "If I win, you acknowledge that appearances can be deceiving and that skill comes in unexpected packages." The stakes were more philosophical than financial, but they carried weight that everyone present understood. This was about more than shooting accuracy. It was about respect, recognition, and the dangerous assumption that credentials and reputation necessarily indicated capability. "Agreed," Eric said without hesitation, clearly confident in his abilities and curious to test Sarah's skills under actual pressure. Marcus set up a clean target at 50 yards for each competitor, while the crowd arranged themselves for optimal viewing of what promised to be a memorable contest. Word of the challenge had spread throughout the range, and shooters from every lane had gathered to witness the competition. Sarah and Eric took their positions at adjacent firing lines, each making final preparations with the methodical care that serious shooting demanded. The contrast between them was striking. Eric with his expensive competition gear and patches documenting years of victories, Sarah with her simple equipment and quiet confidence that had been forged in countless hours of desert practice. "Shooters ready?" Marcus called out, his voice carrying the authority of someone who had officiated numerous competitions over the years. Both competitors indicated their readiness, and the range fell into the kind of absolute silence that preceded significant moments. Even the ambient noise of the ventilation system seemed muted as dozens of experienced shooters prepared to witness a contest that would likely be discussed and analyzed for months afterward. "Stand by," Marcus announced, building the tension that preceded the start signal. In that moment of suspended anticipation, Sarah felt the familiar calm that her grandfather had taught her to cultivate before difficult shots. Her breathing deepened and slowed. Her heart rate settled into the steady rhythm that indicated optimal physiological conditions for precision shooting. The voices and faces around her faded into background awareness as her focus narrowed to the essential elements: sight picture, trigger control, and the small target that waited 50 yards away. Eric, meanwhile, settled into the competition mindset that had served him well in dozens of matches. His extensive experience under pressure was an advantage that he expected to prove decisive when the time constraints eliminated Sarah's ability to take careful, deliberate shots. The range held its breath as Marcus raised his hand for the start signal that would begin a competition whose outcome would challenge everything the assembled shooters thought they knew about skill, experience, and the true nature of marksmanship under pressure. The sharp crack of Marcus's starting signal would soon trigger not just 2 minutes of intense shooting, but a demonstration that would redefine everyone's understanding of what was possible when natural talent met perfect training and unshakable confidence. The sharp crack of Marcus's starting signal shattered the silence like breaking glass, and immediately the range filled with the synchronized rhythm of 2 marksmen operating at the highest levels of their craft. Eric Morrison moved with the fluid efficiency of countless competitions, his first shot breaking within 8 seconds of the start signal with the crisp authority of precision ammunition. Sarah's approach was markedly different. Where Eric's movements were aggressive and economical, hers were measured and deliberate. Her first shot came nearly 15 seconds after the signal, but when it broke, the sound carried a quality that made experienced ears pause with recognition. It was the unmistakable crack of a perfectly executed shot, where every variable had been controlled and every fundamental executed flawlessly. The contrast in their shooting styles was immediately apparent to the watching crowd. Eric fired with the machine-like consistency of someone who had drilled identical movements thousands of times under competition pressure. His shots came at regular intervals, each separated by approximately 20 seconds of preparation and execution. Sarah's timing was less predictable, but no less impressive. Her shots came when they were ready, not according to any predetermined schedule. Some broke quickly, others took longer to develop, but each one carried the unmistakable authority of complete technical control. By the 45-second mark, Eric had fired 3 rounds and was preparing his 4th, maintaining the aggressive pace that had won him numerous competitions. His movements showed no signs of haste or pressure, just the steady progression of someone executing a familiar routine under familiar circumstances. Sarah had fired 2 rounds by the same point, but her economy of movement suggested absolute confidence in her shot process. There was no wasted motion, no uncertainty, no indication that the time pressure was affecting her ability to execute her fundamentals. The assembled crowd watched in absolute silence, afraid that any sound might distract the competitors during this remarkable demonstration of precision shooting under pressure. Many of them were experienced enough to appreciate the technical difficulty of what they were witnessing. Handgun accuracy at 50 yards with time constraints that pushed even expert marksmen to their limits. At the 1-minute mark, Eric had completed 4 shots and was settling into his final attempt. His breathing was controlled, his movements precise, his focus absolute. The years of competition experience were clearly serving him well under the pressure of public performance and challenging conditions. Sarah had fired 3 rounds and was preparing for her 4th, her unhurried pace suggesting complete confidence in her ability to complete the course of fire within the allotted time. Her breathing remained deep and controlled, her stance unchanged from her earlier demonstrations, her focus seemingly unaffected by the competitive environment. Eric's 5th and final shot broke at 1 minute and 20 seconds, completing his string with the same technical proficiency he had displayed throughout. He immediately stepped back from the firing line and began the process of retrieving his target, his expression showing the satisfied confidence of someone who had executed his best possible performance under challenging conditions. Sarah continued her preparation for her 4th shot, seemingly oblivious to the fact that her opponent had already finished. Her movements remained unhurried and deliberate, suggesting that she was operating according to her own internal timeline rather than responding to external pressure. Her 4th shot broke at 1 minute and 35 seconds, leaving her 25 seconds to complete her final round. For most shooters, this would have represented serious time, pressure requiring rushed preparation, and compromised technique. Sarah's demeanor suggested that 25 seconds was perfectly adequate for what she needed to accomplish. The crowd watched with growing tension as she prepared for her final shot. The time constraint that had seemed reasonable at the beginning now appeared aggressive, and many observers wondered if the pressure would finally reveal the limitations that had remained hidden during her earlier demonstrations. But Sarah's final preparation sequence unfolded with the same methodical precision that had characterized her entire evening. Her breathing deepened and slowed, her sight alignment achieved the perfect relationship between front and rear sights, her trigger finger applied pressure with the graduated control that her grandfather had drilled in her muscle memory through countless repetitions. Her final shot broke with 3 seconds remaining on the timer, completing her string with the same technical authority that had marked every round she had fired that evening. The timing suggested perfect calculation rather than rushed execution, as if she had known exactly how long each shot would require and had budgeted her time accordingly. Marcus activated the target retrieval systems for both lanes simultaneously, and the mechanical whir of the motors filled the silence as both targets began their journey back from the 50-yard line. The crowd pressed forward expectantly, Their conversations reduced to whispers as they prepared to witness the outcome of the most remarkable shooting competition most of them had ever observed. Eric's target arrived first, and the result drew immediate murmurs of appreciation from the knowledgeable crowd. His five-shot group measured approximately 2.5 inches from edge to edge, centered perfectly in the bullseye. It was exceptional shooting by any standard, the kind of performance that had won him numerous competitions and established his reputation as one of the region's premier marksmen. Outstanding shooting, Marcus announced, measuring the group with calipers to confirm the precise dimensions. 2.4 inches center to center, all shots in the scoring rings. That's championship-level marksmanship. The compliment was well-deserved. Under time pressure at 50 yards, Eric had demonstrated exactly why his reputation was so formidable. His group size represented accuracy that most recreational shooters could not achieve under any conditions, accomplished under constraints that would have challenged Olympic-level competitors. As Sarah's target reached the firing line, an unusual silence fell over the gathered crowd. Even before the precise measurements were taken, it was obvious that something extraordinary had occurred. The target showed not 5 distinct bullet holes, but what appeared to be a single enlarged hole surrounded by barely visible tears in the paper. Marcus approached the target with his measuring calipers, his expression showing the careful concentration of someone who wanted to ensure absolute accuracy in his assessment. The crowd pressed closer, their whispered conversations falling silent as they waited for the official measurement. "Ladies and gentlemen," Marcus said, his voice carrying a note of amazement that he couldn't quite suppress. "This group measures 1.1 inches center to center. All 5 shots are within the X-ring." The announcement was met with stunned silence. 1.1 inches at 50 yards with a handgun represented accuracy that challenged the limits of what was physically possible with iron sights and human vision. It was the kind of group size that belonged in record books rather than casual range competitions. But Marcus wasn't finished with his analysis. As he continued to examine Sarah's target under magnification, additional details became apparent that transformed remarkable shooting into something that bordered on the supernatural. "Actually," he corrected, his voice now carrying obvious disbelief, "I need to revise that measurement. 4 of the 5 shots are within 0.7 of an inch, and 3 of them appear to have gone through the same hole." The crowd erupted in amazement, their professional composure finally breaking under the weight of what they had witnessed. 3 shots through the same hole at 50 yards was the stuff of legend, the kind of shooting that old-timers claimed to have seen, but that no one really believed was possible. Eric approached Sarah's target to examine the results personally, his expression showing the professional curiosity of someone who needed to understand what he was seeing. As a competitive shooter and custom gunsmith, he understood exactly how difficult what Sarah had accomplished really was. "This is impossible," he said quietly, though his tone suggested amazement rather than denial. "The human eye can't resolve sight pictures precisely enough to achieve this kind of accuracy at 50 yards. Sarah smiled with the quiet confidence that had characterized her entire evening. "My grandfather used to say that the eye only sees what the mind expects it to see. He taught me to trust my fundamentals even when logic suggested that the shot couldn't be made." She retrieved a small, worn photograph from her wallet and showed it to the assembled crowd. The black and white image showed an elderly Hispanic man in marine dress blues, his chest decorated with an impressive array of ribbons and decorations that included the Navy Cross and 2 Purple Hearts. "Staff Sergeant Miguel Martinez," she said with obvious pride and affection. "He served 3 tours as a sniper and was credited with over 200 confirmed kills. But more importantly, he understood that shooting was about more than hitting targets. It was about discipline, concentration, and the belief that human potential has no limits when properly developed." The photograph passed through the crowd, and the experienced shooters immediately recognized the significance of the decorations displayed on Miguel's uniform. The Navy Cross was the 2nd highest decoration for valor in the Marine Corps, awarded only for extraordinary heroism in combat situations. Combined with his sniper credentials, it painted a picture of someone who had operated at the very pinnacle of military marksmanship. He spent 10 years teaching me everything he had learned in 3 wars, Sarah continued, her voice carrying the reverence that her grandfather's memory deserved. Not just how to shoot, but how to think like a marksman, how to see possibilities instead of limitations, how to achieve precision that most people believe is impossible. Eric extended his hand to Sarah with the genuine respect that one master extends to another. Ma'am, I owe you an apology. I came here thinking that competition experience was the only measure of real shooting ability. You've shown me that true marksmanship transcends anything I've learned in formal competitions. The gesture meant more than any trophy or recognition could have. Eric's reputation made his acknowledgement of Sarah's superiority a statement that would resonate throughout the regional shooting community for years to come. You don't owe me anything, Sarah replied graciously, accepting his handshake with the firm grip that her grandfather had taught her was essential between equals. Competition shooting and precision shooting are different disciplines, each with their own challenges and rewards. You've mastered your chosen field, and I respect that accomplishment. As the evening wound down and the crowd began to disperse, the conversations buzzed with analysis and speculation about what they had witnessed. Many of the shooters made plans to return the following evening, hoping for additional instruction from someone whose abilities had redefined their understanding of what was possible with a handgun. Marcus approached Sarah as she was packing her equipment, his expression showing a mixture of professional admiration and business curiosity. Ma'am, I hope you'll consider making this a regular thing, he said sincerely. What happened here tonight was special, and I think a lot of people could benefit from learning your techniques. Sarah considered the suggestion carefully. When she had driven to the range that evening, her only goal had been routine practice to maintain the skills that her grandfather had taught her. She had never intended to become an instructor or to challenge anyone's preconceptions about gender and firearms. But the evening had revealed something important about the power of proper instruction and the impact that one person could have on others' understanding of their own potential. The improvement she had witnessed in even basic shooters suggested that her grandfather's teachings could benefit far more people than just herself. I'll think about it, she said finally, though her tone suggested that the answer was likely to be positive. As Sarah walked out of the range that night, she carried with her not just the satisfaction of having honored her grandfather's memory, but the recognition that his lessons were too valuable to keep to herself. The skepticism and condescension that had greeted her arrival had been transformed into respect and eagerness to learn, proving once again that performance speaks louder than assumptions. The men who had ridiculed her entrance had learned something far more valuable than shooting technique that evening. They had discovered that expertise comes in unexpected packages, that gender has nothing to do with skill, and that the most dangerous mistake a person can make is underestimating someone based on appearance rather than ability. But perhaps most importantly, they had witnessed the power of proper teaching and the remarkable improvement that becomes possible when fundamental principles are understood and applied correctly. Sarah's grandfather had taught her that knowledge shared multiplies rather than diminishes, and that the greatest honor a student can give their teacher is to pass those lessons on to others who could benefit from them. As she drove home that night, Sarah smiled as she imagined her grandfather's reaction to the evening's events. He would have been proud of her shooting, certainly, but even more pleased that she had used the opportunity to educate rather than simply dominate. After all, the greatest marksmen were not those who hoarded their knowledge, but those who used it to elevate others to levels they never thought possible. The story of what happened at Precision Point shooting range that Tuesday evening would be told and retold throughout the regional firearms community, growing with each telling but never quite capturing the full impact of witnessing someone transcend the boundaries that most people accept as absolute. It became a legend about skill overcoming prejudice, determination defeating assumption, and the timeless truth that the most powerful weapon anyone can possess is the knowledge to use their potential without limits.